Uh, All right, well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about a fun subject. It's June, which means there are new forms. And so we're going to talk about a new form, and it's a contingency removal form and contingencies, because contingencies are just so interesting, right? And in fact, there's enough new forms. I'm thinking about doing a series on the new forms, how to fill them out, what do they mean. My thought right now is I'm going to call this series Fun with Forms. It took me a while to think of that. If you have better suggestions, let me know. But we're going to talk about some really fun forms. And there's a handout which Ra is sharing with y'all. And what I think would be a good way to begin anything like this is, well, with a quiz. How about that? Or, well, it's a poll. So can everybody see it? Sometimes I'm not sure if it's showing. Nod if you can see the poll. No one's nodding, so, and nobody's answering.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. It's a hard one, but the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies. Right, and they've been told to, but they just don't do it. The date for contingency removal has come and gone. What's going to happen is that, well, A, buyer is out of contract and could lose their deposit. B, buyer is out of contract, but will keep their deposit. Or C, there is no change in the contract at all. Everybody vote if you don't mind. So far, nobody's voted, which is worrying me a little bit.
I voted.
All right. That's weird because it's not showing me that anybody voted. Am I, Rod, am I not a...
I can see on my end.
Right, but I don't see any results. So it may mean that I'm not the host. I don't know.
I'm co-host Michael. You're the host.
Yeah, but it's not showing up on mine. So we're going to have to, I don't know what the results.
I'll share it to you.
All right. So most of you picked, what is it, 38%. We'll have to figure out why I can't see the poll results, but 38% said buyers out of contract and lose their deposit. Yeah, you hear that a lot from real estate agents, right? I've seen agents, brokers. They said, I've been a broker for 14 years. I'm in the top 2% of all Keller Williams, all Global Banker agents. You know, if you don't get an extension and in your time period comes and goes, that's it, out of contract. Contract is broken, you lose your deposit. That is not the right answer. About 30% said buyer is out of contract and will keep the deposit. The correct answer is there's no change. Right? There's no change. I'll show you the exact contract clause, but the phrase out of contract, right? This was made up by real estate agents on the street, right? This is not a California Association of Realtors lawyer phrase, right? This is a real estate agent phrase. And what the contract says is that if the time periods come and go, unless something else happens, there is no change in the contract. We're still in contract and we keep moving forward. Something has to happen. All right, now let me just see. Maybe it's got, let me go back. You guys did well. So what is it that would have to happen? Anyone have an idea of that? What would have to happen after the contingencies have not been removed on time?
A notice to perform.
A notice to perform, very good. So now it's not even letting me launch the, won't even let me launch the poll right now. I don't know what the issue is, but I can't even launch the second poll. It's not letting me have access to the polls anymore. Well, that's disappointing. I don't know what I can do about that right now. I don't know what I can do about it. Can you guys see the 2-day notice to perform poll? I don't know. No, so
It's not letting me launch as well, Michael.
maybe because we're as two hosts, so I don't know what to do. All right, so I can't, we're not gonna be able to do that. So that's fine. I can live with that. Let's, so what the next question was, so the first question was, if the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies, are they out of contract, lose their deposit? And the answer is no, it just keeps going. So the next question is, well, what would have to happen in order for something to change? And the answer is there would have to be a 2-day notice to perform. Let's say that the seller gives the buyer the 2-day notice to perform.
We are seeing it now.
Now we're seeing, all right. And of course, I can't see what the results are, but oh, that's it. You have to end the first poll to launch the second poll. I've lost control. So I don't know what the choices are that people are picking, but the question was, so you've been given the 2-day notice to perform, you don't perform, right? You didn't remove the contingencies when you're supposed to, you get the 2-day notice, 2 days comes and goes, you haven't done anything, where are we now? Is it A, the buyer's out of contract and will lose the deposit? That, by the way, has 50% of the votes. It's not correct, but it has 50% of the votes. Buyer is out of contract and will keep their deposit. That came in at about 20%. Oh, it's redistributed a little bit. And thank you, 47% after we've gotten more votes. The ones who thought about it, I guess, voted differently. There is no change in the contract. So contingencies are not removed on time, no change in the contract. Buyer gets a notice to perform, 2-day notice to perform. They don't perform, there's still no change in the contract, because something else would have to happen. And that something else is the seller would have to initiate the cancellation process. I've done recently a transaction. I was helping one of the members of my team where we sent a notice to perform knowing the seller would not be able to perform, but we didn't cancel the contract afterwards. What we wanted was the ability to cancel the contract. All right, we wanted to be able to do that, but we didn't actually want to cancel the contract. All right, so I'm going to do less polling for a while, but what you've been given copies of a handout, and I'm going to, anyhow, we're going to just go through some things. Some of you are already going through some things. And by the way, all results from polls and classes like this that I do, I send to the California Department of Real Estate to look at, just so you know, right? This one there, you might be hearing from a broker. So some of the questions that come up with contingencies, and a contingency is an if, or another way to say it, it's an only if in a contract. So I'm willing to buy your house, but only if I can get a loan. I'm willing to buy your house, but only if I can sell my house. I'm willing to buy your house, but only if it appraises. You get the idea. So the questions are, what happens if the buyer doesn't remove their contingency? What can the seller do if the buyer doesn't remove their contingency? What happens if a buyer removes all their contingencies and then finds something wrong with the property? Now what happens? What is the rule for cancellation based upon an inspection contingency? I think we're going to talk about that. And is a buyer guaranteed to get their money back if they have properly canceled the contract? Unfortunately, the answer isn't always yes, right? Just because, you know, just because. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So contingencies is a if in a contract where you're basically saying we're buying the property, but subject to this particular contingency. Now, it could be based upon an inspection. We're going to talk about what that contingency really means. It could be because of a loan contingency. I need to update the percentage. And you might have a contingency if you're buying vacant land on approval of building plans and things like that. By the way, that's why land takes so long to sell. Because the buyer doesn't want to buy it until the buyer is sure the buyer can do what they want to, but who's going to tell them exactly yes or no, you can do what you want to? Well, the city will, but that takes sometimes a really long time, right? In order to be certain that you can do what you want to. So these are the 8 common contingencies that are contained in the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement. Well, it doesn't mean you have to have them. These are the ones that are already hardwired in, right? Boxes that check, things like that. The loan, appraisal, investigation. We used to call that inspection, but investigation is a better, more descriptive phrase. Reviewing the seller documents is a contingency. The title report is a contingency. Common interest disclosures, HOA, is a contingency. Review of leased or liened items like solar panels is a contingency. And the sale of buyer's property is a contingency if you attach the COP form, the COP form. Now, that doesn't mean we've exhausted the possible list of contingencies. So if we've already mentioned the contingency of the sale of property, the COP form, but it might be, and we're going to look at this one, we're not going to go through the form necessarily, but there's only one seller contingency that commonly appears. And I'm not going to spend much time on it because it's not as common. It's a little more common now than it was a couple of years ago, but that is the sale of property and finding a replacement property. So the seller would say, my sale is contingent upon me finding a replacement property. Other contingencies could be for lender approval if it's a short sale, or court approval, which might be required in certain trusts and bankruptcies and other things like that. And if you're not sure, if you're not the only one calling the shots and you're the seller, you might have a contingency for other title holders to approve. These are some not nearly as common, but other contingencies that we see, in contracts. So this is a part of the grid, and it's called contingencies. And these are the default group. I guess that's the way to put it. Now, I've been asked in the past, why 17 days? Right? You'll notice it's 17 days for loans and appraisal, investigation, and 17 days. And the answer is, well, it was sort of a compromise that the forms people made, because they thought, well, 21 is kind of long, and 12 isn't maybe enough. And so they split the difference. So how long you need would depend on various factors. So for example, the loan contingency, well, maybe you're pre-approved, maybe it's gone to underwriting, but if there are issues, right, 17 days usually is enough time to figure that out. Many lenders will brag that they can close in 21 days, which means they ought to know in 17. There's always risks involved, because if the buyer is doing weird stuff, right, near the close of escrow, they might not any longer have an approved loan. If there's no loan contingency, then over on the right, you would check that box. Appraisal, this 17 days, most of the time we're reducing the number, even if it's 12, right? Even if we knocked off 5 days, it's a way of communicating to the seller that we're going to do this as quickly as possible. Now, you get two choices when it comes to the appraisal contingency in terms of waiving or modifying it. The one on the right is no appraisal contingency. And the reason for that is that sometimes when the market is heating up, appraisals don't keep up with the market. And some buyers were saying, well, look at, I want it bad, I want to own that house, so I'm willing to make up the difference. Now, my suggestion is if somebody says, well, I don't need an appraisal contingency, we've got room, I would say, all right, just so you know, we understand what we're doing here. If we're offering $1 million and it appraises for $975, what that means is that you're going to have to put in $25,000 over and above your deposit and down payment that's on the first page of the RPA. Over, in addition to everything you've heard about that you're going to have to spend in order to buy this house, you're going to have to throw in another $25,000. Can you do that? Do you want to do that? Would you do that? And if the buyer says 25,000, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, okay. How about 50? How about 50? If we write an offer for 1 million and it appraises for 950, are you willing to throw in an extra 50 grand over and above your expected down payment? And they say, no, that's too much. I can't do that. Or that's it, all right? That's all I can do. So on the left, under contingencies, this is in the third column, it says appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at a minimum purchase price, or, and you check a box, and you can write in another number. So for example, let's say the offer was $1 million. The most my client has extra is 50 grand, or at least that's the most they're willing to contribute. So we would check the box and write 950,000, which means that if it appraises for 950 or above, we're cool. But if it's less than 950, then it didn't appraise and we can get out. Let me ask you guys this. Supposing we offer $1 million, we write in 950. This is called the appraisal gap clause. We write in 950, but the seller counters us. They counter our 1 million offer, and they counter at 1.1. Right? They call me up and they say, look, we got multiple offers. Yeah, you guys are, not in the top 5. So we're countering everybody at 1, and they give me a counter for 1.1. Here's my question for you. Does it have to appraise for 950 or above? Is that 950 that we wrote in here still operative? Or is the difference, which is 50 grand, now calculated on the new price of 1.1? Does anybody want to take a shot at that? Does the 950 stick? Or if there's a counter offer and the price changes, is the gap kept and just applied to the higher price? Anyone want to? Don't everybody blurt out an answer at once. Okay.
I'm thinking the 950.
You're thinking the 950. So now the appraisal gap could be 150,000 instead of 50.
Well, it's a counter offer, so you haven't agreed to it yet. So
Let's say we do agree. We signed it. We're in a hurry. We signed it. What's the gap? Is the gap, does it still exist? Maybe it was countered out. They didn't mention it, but the price changed. So here's what's going to happen. The $50,000 gap keeps, not the 950. So if it's 1.1 is our counter, it is 1,050,000 is the new number, because the amount that the buyer said they would be willing to kick in is 50 grand. It would be subtracted from the new price. By the way, the California Association of Realtors Lawyers put in, this is coming up, a math example in the form. And the math example was about $1 million house and a 950 and a 1.1. We'll look at it later. So the gap sticks. It's not the original price because of the counter. All right. So that was fun. Investigation of the property, 17 days. Is that enough time? Yeah. Usually we lower it to 12. It all depends, right? Right now, it's not difficult to get a termite inspection, a property inspection, right? They're not as busy as they were at one point. Does the seller already have a property inspection, a termite inspection? Have they got they have all that stuff. You could make it smaller, into shorter, I guess. Informational access is different than investigation. So what informational access is, I get to go to the property and look around during escrow if I'm the buyer. Even if there's no inspection or investigation contingency, the buyer still has a right to access the property, to take pictures, measurements. I've had sellers say, no, you don't. I had a listing agent say, no, you guys don't have a inspection contingency, so you can't come and look at the house until it closes. I'm like, no, that's not what it, no. The buyer's right to access the property for informational purposes is not a contingency, does not create cancellation of rights, and here it is, applies even if contingencies are removed. It's not connected to the contingencies. Review of the seller's documents, HOA, how about? That's coming up. So let me ask you this. Buyer makes an offer without contingencies, no inspection contingency, but they haven't received the seller property questionnaire. But they checked the box that said, we got no contingencies. Do they still have a contingency? No seller property questionnaire. Buyer says, I don't need to review seller's documents. I remove that contingency. Then they get the seller property questionnaire. Can they back out? Because does that trigger a right of rescission? And the answer is maybe. It depends. So one of the things that comes up, and this is also true with HOA docs. So let's say the HOA docs are not ready. Buyer makes an offer with no inspection, investigation, contingency. They removed all their contingencies. Then the HOA docs finally arrive. Can they back out based upon the content? So this is very similar to the SPQ question. And the answer is, it depends. Because it's not a contingency necessarily for the receipt of the documents, but it's a contingency regarding what did the document say. So for example, if there's information in the SPQ or the HOA docs that is a material fact that hasn't been disclosed yet, that gives the buyer an out. But the buyer just can't say, oh, well, you know, you gave it to me and that gives me a right of rescission. Now, the transfer disclosure statement is different. The natural hazard disclosure statement is different because those are hardwired into the code. And I've got this coming up, but if you give somebody a transfer disclosure statement, they have 3 days to back out. If you give them an NHD, they have 3 days to back out. If you're giving it to them after you're in escrow. It doesn't matter that the buyer has waived their contingencies. The ones in the civil code cannot be waived and they can back out. But the seller property questionnaire is not in the civil code. By the way, HOA documents, some of them are. The California Civil Code says that the seller must give a buyer certain documents, the CC&Rs, financial statements, and things like that. Common interest disclosures. By the way, you're gonna want to make sure that your loan agent has seen them and read them before they remove the loan contingency. Just saying. Preliminary title report is a contingency. If they gave you one, you could remove it. Leased or liened items. I'm going to be doing a special session just on solar panels, which are just, it's just been awful. So we're going to try to shine some light on all the different solar, but one of the issues with the solar panels is that if they're leased, is there's a copy of the lease and the lease has to be assumed, and that can take time, and it can be a pain. And then the buyer doesn't like the lease because it's a terrible lease. Sale of the buyer's property, if you check the box, then there's a contingency for that. Or over on the right, you can simply check the box that says we're removing contingencies. Now, if you look at the right, no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency. So if those are the only two that you're removing, but you're keeping the investigation contingency, then what you would do is not check that box on the right, the one that says removal or waiver of contingencies. If you're only removing the loan and the appraisal, we usually just check those two boxes because it says we're removing a loan and we don't have an appraisal contingency. The other longer group, as you're going to see, is what we would be generally referring to in the form, the contingency removal form, CRB, which we're going to look at soon. So loan contingency, let me ask you this. I wish my quiz worked. I wish the polls were working, but anyhow, this will be a rhetorical question. You have removed all your contingencies except the loan contingency. Right? You just removed the inspection. All you got left is the loan contingency. And it turns out the buyer cannot obtain affordable insurance, homeowners insurance. They can't get insurance. Lender says, since you can't get homeowners insurance, we're not going to make you a loan. Remember, the buyer only has a loan contingency. Can they back out and get their money back? So,
Yes.
and I hear the answer is yes. The answer is no, because the insurance contingency, look at paragraph A2. Buyer is advised to investigate the insurability of the property as early as possible, as this may be a requirement of lending. Buyer's ability to obtain insurance for the property, including fire insurance, is part of the buyer's investigation of property contingency. Failure of buyer to obtain insurance may justify cancellation based upon the investigation contingency, but not the loan contingency. It's an insurance problem, not a loan problem. You say, well, the insurance problem is causing me a loan problem. Well, sorry. So if we're going to look at the contingency removal form, the new form. If you're not really sure, you ought to start the process of saying if you can get homeowners insurance early in the transaction. Early, not late, right? Early. Because if you remove your loan contingency and then can't close because you can't get insurance, it doesn't help. This, by the way, is similar to the appraisal contingency, in that if the property doesn't appraise, that might mean you won't get a loan. But that's not a loan contingency. It's a separate contingency. Yeah, and by the way, paragraph 4, if there's an appraisal contingency, removing the loan contingency doesn't remove the appraisal contingency. And just saying no loan anyhow, I already said. Appraisal. So we already went through the appraisal gap. There's a part here that I wanted to remove the pictures. without requiring repairs or improvements to the property, appraisals are often a reliable source to verify square footage of the subject property. However, the ability to cancel based on the measurements provided in an appraisal falls within the investigation of property contingency. All right. So we have an argument, let's say, a debate as to exactly how big is this house. We're not really sure. How big is the lot? We're not really sure. So the appraiser goes out and the appraiser measures the house. And then the appraiser comes back with a number that's several hundred square feet less than what it said in the multiple listing service. Buyer wants out. The problem is that the appraiser appraised the property for the purchase price. The appraiser did not come up with a low appraisal, but the appraiser had a different square footage amount than what was in the multiple listing service. Can the buyer back out? The answer is no. Because things like measuring is the investigation contingency, not the appraisal contingency. The appraisal contingency is, did it appraise or not? If it appraises, it doesn't matter what other things you learned as a result. If there's no appraisal contingency, it means that you have to make up the difference. And you can't cancel just because you don't have enough money and maybe keep your deposit. Investigation of the property. This is a short sentence. It makes a reference to paragraph 12, which is coming up. But look at the wording here in paragraph C. This agreement is contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. Buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. That's about as broad of a contingency as you can get. Right? Essentially, it is saying if the buyer decides that they don't like the property for some reason, they don't have to buy it. That's what it says. And then review of the seller's documents is another contingency. This, by the way, speaks to why, if you're the listing agent, you want to get all this stuff together and give it to the buyer before they write the offer, because it shortens the time period they have to complain. Title. That usually just means looking at the preliminary title report, right? Agents are often asking me to read a prelim and what should I, what's important. Now, which is also why I have the escrow officers occasionally talk about this. But if you are, by the way, if you're given the preliminary report prior to writing the offer, then there isn't the 5 days to, cancel. If you're given the prelim after you're in contract, then you have 5 days. There's that general 5-day rule, right? So you're supposed to read it. Condominium and disclosures, talked about buyer review of leased or liened items. If there are solar panels, you want to start right away finding out, is there a lease, is there a loan, and finding who the current solar company is, because they merged and taken over each other's database, and you need to get on that sooner than later, because we have transactions that get held up at the last minute because there's a transfer of a solar lease, a transfer, things like that. Removal or waiver of contingencies with offer. Buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, and information pertaining to that contingency. This, by the way, is a true statement. You shouldn't, I would say, remove contingencies unless you have copies of all of the documents you want. Is there a property inspection? Is there a termite inspection? Do you have a prelim? Right? Just as a basic group. If there's an HOA, have you looked at the HOA documents? If buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from seller, buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. So if you make a contingency with, if you don't have an investigation contingency and then the seller starts turning over stuff, depending upon the stuff, you might not have a right to back out. Right, certain stuff you can. I think if do we have just looking to see, based upon my limit regarding solar panel leaks, it's about calling the solar almost daily until they get, yes, it's all right. And notice it says you're acting against the advice of agent if you make a non-contingent offer. We'll talk about that in a minute, all right? Because there's also reality. Removal of contingency or cancellation, right? This is part of what's in the residential purchase agreement. So one of the questions is it an active or passive removal? Which I have a slide coming up. What that means is that if there's a 7-day inspection contingency and the 17 days comes and goes, does that mean the contingency has been removed? And the answer is no. That would be what was called passive removal, which is you don't have to do anything and it just happens on a given date. The residential purchase agreements, all of them written by the California Association of Realtors, are active removals, which means in order for the contingency to be removed, the buyer, most of the time we're talking about the buyer, has to in writing remove the contingency. Lapse of time does not remove a contingency. What it does is it gives the seller the right to cancel, but it doesn't happen automatically. So it says here in number 2, for the contingencies for review of seller's document, prelim, condo, buyer shall within the time period after delivery, or whichever, remove the applicable contingency in writing or cancel. That's what it says. You're supposed to remove it or cancel. But if you don't do anything, it just keeps going. So this is the investigation contingency. This is the one that says you have to accept the condition and any other matters affecting the property. And it gives you a long, long list. You can conduct inspections, investigation, tests, surveys, and other studies. They could include, but are not limited to, a home inspection, lead-based paint. That's actually kind of important. If the property was built before 1978, buyers have a 10-day statutory right to inspect the property for lead paint. It's in the code. It could be a termite inspection, which is what B1C says. But notice B1D, any other specific inspections of the physical condition of the land and improvement, any other. And investigation, this is in 2, of any other matter affecting the property other than those that are specified in separate contingencies should include, but is not limited to, an investigation of the availability, cost of homeowners insurance, flood insurance. All right. So a lot of times buyers will say, look, I want to write an offer. I want it to be contingent on me being able to demolish the house and build a house I want. I want it to be right in that it's contingent on me being able to build, get permission to build at least a 4-unit building on the property. How about this? Also write in that I want, I have to bite my tongue when I hear that a lot, because if you have an inspection contingency, you have the right to all those things. You can check permits. You can talk to the planning commission. You could submit plans. You could check out whether or not there's any zoning limitations or anything you want, you could go and investigate. And if you found something that you didn't like, you could use that to back out of the contract. So sometimes we go ahead and make that list when the buyer says, be sure to put this in and be sure to put that in, and be sure that we go ahead and make this list just to make them, pacified. But in fact, it's not necessarily helping. It's making it clear what we're going to inspect. But do you understand the issue could be if this ever was, in a lawsuit, that the lawyer would be asking you, well, what did you mean by writing all that stuff in? And you say, well, we just wanted to make sure that it was contingent on these things. Well, didn't this contract already give you the right to inspect? Yeah. So why then did you make this list? Were you planning on limiting your buyer's right to inspect to just those things you wrote down? Oh, no, we wanted anything that came up. Well, that's how we start. Why then did you give us the specific list if you're now saying that there was nothing specific that you were limiting you understand it's sort of hard to explain why you did it if the contract already gave you the right to inspect everything. But we do it anyhow, because sometimes the buyer feels better when they see that mentioned in the contract. But the reality is anything. How about this? So I tell agents that are on my team, if a buyer wants to back out with the inspection contingency, talk to me first, right? Because there's a contract clause that says that anything like this, any contingency like this that is being used has to be done in good faith. So I had a transaction where the property didn't appraise, but they did not have an appraisal contingency. So, but they had an inspection contingency. So the buyer, the agent I didn't think was, I don't know, he could have been craftier, but the reasons he gave for their inspection contingency was, number one, the garage is only 2.5 cars, not 3. And number two, there wasn't enough room in the backyard to put in a kidney-shaped pool. Those were the 2 reasons he gave for backing out of the contract, when we all knew it because it didn't appraise. Well, the problem with those 2 reasons is that they were evident when the property was shown to the buyer. The buyer looked at the garage. There's pictures on the MLS of what the garage looked like. The buyer saw the backyard, right? You understand, they didn't learn anything, right? And so I said, we're not releasing your deposit. Right? We're going to sit on it until we sell the property to somebody else. Go ahead, they got a lawyer. I just say, hey, let's see if we sell it to somebody. We're not releasing your deposit. You have to be sneakier. So for example, if you check out school rankings, you check out crime reports, you say, oh, we went to the neighborhood at night and it was loud and there's lots of noise and we don't, all of that's sort of hard to disprove, right? So you have to come up with something that wasn't obvious when you bought the property that you may have learned. That's whatever. All right. Seller's right to cancel. So if the buyer does not remove their contingencies on time and the seller gives the buyer a notice to perform, then the seller could cancel the contract. Now, that part's easy. We're going to look at the form. How am I doing on time? We're going to look at the form. That part is easy. The part that becomes maybe not so much is the getting the money out of escrow, right? Because the deposit isn't going to go anywhere until the buyer and the seller both sign something, or an arbitrator or court tells the escrow company to do something with the money. The money's not going to go anywhere. There's no automatic forfeiture to the seller. There's no automatic refund to the buyer. So the seller, if the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies, gets the notice to perform, doesn't perform, then there's a cancellation. This may seem picky, but it's either party can cancel the contract, but both of them have to be involved to cancel the escrow. Aren't those the same? They're not the same thing. So the seller unilaterally can cancel the contract if buyer doesn't remove their contingencies, doesn't perform with the notice to perform. Seller can cancel the contract, but that doesn't do anything to the deposit. That's escrow. And both parties have to agree to cancel that. Buyer contract obligations, if the buyer doesn't do things that the contract requires, like put the deposit money in 3 days. Or whatever time period you put in. Again, there has to be a notice to perform, and then they don't perform, and then you can cancel the contract. And then there might be seller contingencies, which is usually finding a replacement property, and they could cancel because they couldn't find a replacement property. Not as common. When can the buyer cancel? Well, if the seller says, I'm going to find a replacement property within 2 weeks, and they don't, 2 months or whatever, they don't, you give them a notice to perform, remove that contingency, they won't do it, you can cancel. If the seller doesn't meet their contract obligations, for example, the seller has not properly filled out the seller property questionnaire. The seller left some answers blank. Didn't answer all the questions in the TDS either. So the buyer can give the seller a notice to perform because the contract says that those documents are complete when all questions have been answered. All questions have been answered. Now the buyer's in a pickle because if the buyer, the seller, because if the seller does amend the TDS or the SPQ, that triggers a 3-day right of rescission. If they don't amend the TDS and SPQ within the 2 days to perform, now they've triggered a cancellation right because they didn't perform. Everybody is supposed to use good faith in canceling. All right. Notice of to the buyer or seller to perform. What we're going to go through that form. And what it says is that you have 2 days. Days are calendar days. We're going to talk about days in a moment. What is a day? Does anybody really know? Removal of buyer contingencies. If a buyer removes a contingency or right, then they aren't supposed to use that as a reason for backing out of the contract. If they've removed it, then that no longer becomes a reason for backing out of the contract. Same thing with the seller. What about the deposit? If buyer or seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to whatever it says there, to the rights duly exercised under the terms of the agreement, the parties agree to sign and deliver mutual instructions to cancel the sale and release deposits. So what this is saying is that if buyer does not remove their contingencies, buyer gets a notice to perform. Buyer does not perform. Seller then cancels. Seller has to give back the deposit. When would the buyer lose their deposit? If they remove the contingency and then could not close because of that contingency. But if they do not remove their contingencies ever, and the seller cancels them, the contract says they have to release the deposit. They don't get to keep it. However, to actually do that requires a mutually signed release instructions, a judicial decision, or an arbitration. How about the walkthrough? All right, so we're going on the walkthrough 3 days before escrow is going to close. Buyer sees stuff buyer doesn't like. Buyer's unhappy. There's personal property. There's debris. Looks like something was broken. Can the buyer back out, hold up escrow? Is that a contingency that it passed final inspection? And the answer is it's not a contingency. So the verification of condition, which is what we oftentimes call a walkthrough. I've had a lot of times agents have called me up and said, look, I don't know what's going on. I'm trying to do the walkthrough today and I've been on zip forms and I can't find the form. I keep looking, there's no form with walk in it. And then, well, it's called a verification of condition. That's why you're not finding it. It's not a walkthrough form. It's not the official title. It says this is not a contingency of the sale. Now, the reality is the only leverage the buyer really has at that time is to stall closing escrow, threaten not to close. ask for money held back to make sure that it was fixed. But then we're playing, the chicken game where people are writing, towards each other. The buyer doesn't want to drag it out. The seller doesn't want to drag it out. So what the lawyers say is that you should close anyhow and then sue the seller. Of course, lawyers, of course they would say. Buyer cancels on an open contingency. An open contingency means you haven't removed the contingency. If the event doesn't happen, didn't appraise, didn't get the loan, you can cancel. It's not a breach because you can cancel if the contingencies aren't met. Does the buyer have an unlimited right? It's supposed to be in good faith. And the reason that you give has to be related to the contingency you're using. Must be in good faith. That's why you might want to think about what continue. How about this? The last notice to perform I did, which resulted in us drafting a cancellation, I listed about 14 things that we claimed they didn't do that they were supposed to do, or that were wrong, or about, it was a long list. So it's way better, safer, if you're representing a buyer on the investigation contingency, to come up with the longest list possible of things the buyer doesn't like. I don't like the HOA docs. I don't like the noise. I don't like, it's the longer, the easier it is to get it through because it looks more in good faith. Loan contingency, a lot of times agents don't fill out that part. And the part I mean is, what is the loan amount and what is the interest rate and what are the points? Now, if you don't fill that out, the loan contingency doesn't have as much teeth, because the loan contingency is essentially saying, my obligation to buy the property is contingent upon me getting a loan like this. But if you don't have an interest rate, you don't have points, and you don't have any of that other kind of stuff, then a loan like what? We don't know, right? Basically, it seems to me if you get any loan, if you could get any loan, a hard money loan, any loan, then you'd still have to buy it. If you're going to have a loan contingency, you ought to fill out the part that discusses interest rate, points, loan amount. We give buyers and get them to sign. Most offices do a market conditions advisory, and the market conditions advisory says don't make a non-contingent offer. That's what it says. Don't do it. We're telling you don't do it. Don't make an offer without an inspection contingency. We're telling you don't do it. Notice it even says we are recommending that you don't do this. That's what we're recommending. We're telling you not to do it, and if you do it, then you're not paying attention to us. But the reality is, sometimes we're the ones that are telling them they need to do it. I was at lawyers that were doing a session for real estate agents, and what they said was they thought that what we ought to do with buyers is write offers with all the contingencies, have the offers shot down so that the buyer self-discovers that this isn't going to work, and then the buyer says, well, maybe we could make non-contingent offers. Now, I've actually repeated that conversations to buyers and says, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to write contingent offers and not get the house and learn from that experience? Or would you like to maybe try to buy the house right off the bat? Most of them will say, well, let's just do it. By the way, if each contingency is like having an escape hatch from escrow, right? And if you start, you have a loan and an appraisal on all of these contingencies, the whole boat is filled with escape hatches, and every contingency you remove is nailing that hatch shut. If I were left with only one escape hatch, it would be the investigation contingency, because that one pretty much says if you've come up with any decent reason that you don't like the house, you can back out. Non-optional contingencies. If it's built before 1978, lead-based paint, 10-day opportunity to inspect it before becoming obligated under the contract. And they don't have to do a lead-based paint inspection, but they have the right to do it. I've never had I've never had a buyer back out because they didn't do a lead-based paint inspection. So Ellen asked, can sellers require that no children be present during the VP, the verification of property condition? I've never had anyone say that. The contract does not say that. The seller has the right to limit who can come. The informational access would include you bringing designers and handymen and others to take a look at the property. So I just would ignore the sellers. I guess it depends on the children. I guess maybe. Non-optional contingencies. So lead-based paint is one. The NHD is a non-optional contingency, which is why you ought to get an NHD report right up front if you're the listing agent. There's a 3-day right of rescission after the buyer has been given the NHD. This cannot be waived. Then there's also the transfer disclosure one, right, which also cannot be waived. So NHD can't be waived, the TDS can't be waived, the right to do a lead inspection cannot be waived. Active or passive, I think I've already explained that. All contracts written by the California Association of Realtors are active removal. What if a buyer removes all the contingencies and then discovers a material defect in the property prior to the close of escrow and wants to cancel? The answer is, it depends. The more accurate way of asking the question, because the buyer always has a right to cancel. You can always cancel. It's a different question whether you get your deposit back, but you can always cancel. That's it, and it may depend on other factors. For example, was the defect that you discovered something the seller was aware of but didn't disclose? If it is, then you can force them through a notice to perform to amend the TDS and SPQ, which triggers a 3-day right of rescission. Triggers a right of rescission. And did the seller know but not disclose it? Another possibility is when the seller becomes aware of something or a material inaccuracy, and what the TDS or the SPQ, if they find new information, then they're supposed to modify the TDS and SPQ, and that also creates a cancellation right. That didn't look good. If a buyer discovers this information through their own investigation, and it was not something that the seller knew about or that the seller discovered, but it was something that the buyer learned, then the buyer does not have a cancellation right. If the buyer has removed their investigation contingency and they discover something that the seller didn't know about, which is why the seller didn't disclose it, because the seller didn't know, but then they find out, too bad, tough luck. They've removed the contingency. So the depends is this something the seller knew about that the seller didn't disclose? If that's true, the buyer has an out, even though they've removed their contingencies. But if it was something else that it wasn't intentional or negligent on the seller's part, then you usually can't build out. If it's visibly obvious, you can't use that. That's not acting in good faith. Buyer contingency removal, new form. Most of it, now the reason they made 2 forms, a buyer contingency removal and the seller contingency removal, there's a lot of similarity, but the reason for doing the 2 forms is because agents were generally confused by the original form, the old form. And the reason that agents were confused is because the top 3/4 of it was removal of the buyer contingencies. And then the bottom, let's say 1/4, was seller contingencies. So agents would see that there's a spot at the bottom of the form for sellers to sign. Therefore, they would conclude that the seller's signature on the buyer contingency removal was important, which it was not. Right? Why then was there a place for the seller to sign at the bottom? And the answer is because the seller might have had a contingency of their own. And so we used one form to remove both buyer and seller contingencies. This caused a lot of confusion. Believe me, I know it did. So the CAR made two forms, one for the buyer and one for the seller. That's one of the big changes. Now, a lot of this is talks about what I've already been talking about. But if we look at buyer removes, generally you have, I'm going to remove individual contingencies. That's paragraph 2. So I can go through and check loan, yes, appraisal, yes. But notice it allows me, like, look at or in 4, entire buyer's investigation contingency except, and I could check boxes, fire, flood, other, or write something in. So if I haven't gotten fire insurance yet, I could say to the seller, I'm removing all of my inspection contingency except fire insurance, which, by the way, is a good idea. Because if you don't get the fire insurance, you won't get the loan and you won't be able to close, and that would still need to be a contingency. So almost the general idea of these is we're going to be specific as to which contingencies we're going to remove. But we do have the option to say we're removing all except, look at paragraph D2, review of all seller documents except government reports, right? Statutory or other disclosures. We've looked at we've looked at your TDS, and we looked at your SPQ and all that other stack of stuff you sent us, right? But we're still reading the HOA docs, right? Preliminary, you see, so these are specific contingencies that we can remove. Now, if you're the listing agent, you would rather see paragraph 3 or 4 page. Paragraph 3 is where we're not, because there's a whole bunch of boxes. We're removing everything except the loan. We're removing everything except appraisal, right? Notice that investigation isn't one of the boxes to check because it's so big, right? And there's so many different things that come under that. And then finally, what we want to see before we close is paragraph 4 check, buyer removes any and all buyer contingencies. Start with individual contingencies, all contingencies except, and any and all contingencies. Notice the buyer to perform in accordance with the terms, seller is giving buyer a notice to perform. And we can say, this is a long form, which contingencies did they not remove on time? Which contractual duties did they not, fulfill? They didn't sign. So this, what if the buyer won't sign the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire, and all the other beautiful disclosures that the listing agent put together? You would give them a notice to perform, saying we want you to sign all this stuff and return it. Return of statutory disclosures, return of lead disclosures, return of fire hardening. We would check all the boxes. Notice it says in the bold, buyer, if you do not remove the specified contingencies and take the specified contractual actions within 2 days, no less than 2 days, you could give more, seller may cancel the agreement. 2 days. What's a day? What is a day? So let's say this would be maybe last week. On Thursday of last week, next year, on Thursday, a buyer receives the notice to perform. It is delivered to the buyer at 4:57 p.m. What day does the buyer have to perform? Is it Friday, Saturday, Sunday? Monday, by the way, is the 4th of July. So what day does buyer have to perform? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, what's the day? Anybody wanna shout out an answer? I see some people are typing. Tuesday, really? Okay, I'll go with Tuesday. All right, I just go with whatever got the most votes. What time on Tuesday? What time? I see 11, 4:57. And we've got a couple, 11:59. 11:59. Because the contract talks about what a day is. And it says that the days are calendar days. But if the day for performance falls on a holiday, a weekend, it rolls over to the next business day, and the contract says you have to do it that day, which means up to 11:59. And I'm not going to, because we're getting to the end, go through all of that, but you might want to read the what is a day is something that comes up a lot. And so I've given you some information about it. That's probably more than enough. The seller's right to cancel. These are the 10 reasons that a seller can cancel a buyer from the contract. They don't remove their contingencies. They don't put in the deposit. Their deposit isn't good. They don't deliver the pre-qualification when they said they were. They didn't deliver verification of down payment. The seller doesn't believe their verification. These are the common ways, and maybe I'll do another session on cancellation, right? Because we've run out of time on these forms. We need an addendum with new dates if we are exceeding timeframes. Teresa asked, also, are we not making our dates? Should we be negotiating new timeframes or doing nothing? So there is a form called ETA, which is the extension of time addendum. And that form, you might guess, is used to extend time periods. And it's called the ETA form. And yes, we ought to be negotiating new timeframes and getting them in writing. We should. All right, now sometimes we're dealing with an agent who doesn't want to, but we do the best we can. But we do have an addendum with the new dates. We should use it. We should all agree to the time frames. I'll do more on cancellation in another session, maybe. My client had fire insurance set and approved, and the insurance company canceled a week before we were supposed to close. Buyer had to get new insurance, found out the company did not want to provide insurance for that particular property due to it being 18 plus acres agricultural. State was not able to provide insurance, but more importantly, get backup insurance just in case. Yes, insurance is a big deal. Getting backup insurance, getting that checked out in advance is a big deal. And not one I'm going to talk much more about today. All right, I went on a little bit long. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks, Michael.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.